On this edition of Friday Night Arcade, I thought it would be fun to take a closer look at some Nintendo 64 games that were made in 2D. The Nintendo 64 was part of the 5th generation of game consoles that ushered in three-dimensional gameplay with games such as Super Mario 64 or Turok Dinosaur Hunter. While it was truly special seeing 3D in gaming for the first time, clearly some developers weren't ready to make that leap just yet, attempting instead to utilize the advanced hardware to try and make the best 2D gaming experience possible. We won't be looking at every 2D Nintendo 64 game today, but we will take a closer look at some that were pretty good and some that maybe weren't so much. It's 2D games on the Nintendo 64 on this edition of Friday Night Arcade. Well, here's something that exists for one reason or another. Asteroids Hyper 64, a 64-bit remake of the arcade classic and one I have fond memories of on the Atari 2600. Seems like a no-brainer, right? Well, okay, so the controls are about the same as you remember from the original. You can rotate, accelerate forward, and brake, as well as warp to another random point on the screen. This time you can choose between various ships, each with their own strengths and weaknesses. I'd recommend picking the one with the most shield power because you're gonna need it. If you hold down the Z trigger, your ship will raise a defense field, and I have to wonder if the programmers put that in after they beta tested this and realized it was nearly impossible to play otherwise. There's so much stuff going on the screen at once that it's difficult to see what you're actually supposed to be shooting at or what's really going on here. You've got a rotating planet in the background and all these colorful stars and galaxies smeared across the screen. Part of the magic of the original is its simplicity. The explosions and sound effects are cool, but the one you'll most be familiar with is probably the sound of your ship exploding repeatedly. Mortal Kombat. I think every kid went through a Mortal Kombat phase. There was an allure to it with all the controversy surrounding the game's violence and gore that most kids just couldn't resist. You just had to have Mortal Kombat in the 90s or you weren't the cool kid. I had all 3 Mortal Kombat games on Super Nintendo, so I was cool, right? Mortal Kombat Trilogy on Nintendo 64 has the dubious honor of being the last Mortal Kombat game I ever officially owned. I played Mortal Kombat 4 in the arcades a few times, but didn't really have any desire to dig into it further. To be honest, my relationship with fighting games in general probably ended with this game. I guess I just grew out of fighting games and find myself seeking out longer games with more substance and adventure. Somewhere along the way as a kid growing up, I think too I figured out these games were really just capitalizing off the allure of the violence and controversy surrounding them without providing much meat in terms of actual gameplay. Also, I felt like everything after Mortal Kombat 2 on Super Nintendo was kind of a downgrade. The play control in Mortal Kombat 2 just felt right, and everything after that always felt a little off. Mortal Kombat Trilogy is no exception, and the controls are just a little wonkers, partly because the Nintendo 64 controller doesn't lend itself to fighting games all that well, and partially because I feel like Midway maybe figured by now they didn't really have to try as hard. You knew if it was Mortal Kombat, it was probably gonna sell. As for this game, well, it's basically a mutated form of all the previous Mortal Kombat games. All of your favorite characters from previous entries in the series are here this time. Well, in the Nintendo 64 port, it's still missing 7 of the 37 playable characters found on other platforms, but most of them are here. There's an aggressor meter that builds up if you can rattle off several faster attacks in a row. Otherwise, it doesn't exactly break the mold as far as early Mortal Kombat games go. Most of the stages look exactly like their Super Nintendo counterparts, so it definitely doesn't feel like a 64-bit upgrade to the series. And there's still never enough time to pull off the damn finishers. But hey, if you're a fan of early games in the series and just want most of the characters in one cartridge, well, Mortal Kombat Trilogy has you covered. And if I'm going to talk about Mortal Kombat Trilogy, I have to at least mention Mortal Kombat Mythologies Sub-Zero. So, at some point along the way, Midway thought it would be cool to do a prequel to the original game featuring one of the series' most popular characters, Sub-Zero. You'd play through the game and find out more about Sub-Zero's backstory through cutscenes as you go. It's really not the worst idea in the world. Mortal Kombat was filled with colorful characters, almost any of which probably has a unique and interesting origin story to tell. The result was Mortal Kombat is a 2D side-scrolling beat-em-up where it looks and feels like a fighting game, but it's not quite that. Actually, the 3D effects of the levels look cool and there's some neat lighting when your character steps in and out of the shadows, but the play control is all kinds of awkward. The familiar mechanics of the fighting games just don't translate well at all to a 2D beat 'em up. If the enemy is behind you, you have to press the B button to tell Sub-Zero to turn around. And Sub-Zero doesn't start out with all of his cool moves from the game either. You have to learn them as you go. The plan was to do more of these Mythologies games featuring other popular characters such as Liu Kang or Scorpion, but audiences and critics alike collectively crapped on this one and the whole series ended up getting scrapped. Next up, Dr. Mario 64. If you love Dr. Mario, you're in luck because it's basically the same game, just with a nice little spit polish and some more fluid character animations. Okay, I've crapped on Dr. Mario in the past. Not because of the game itself, but because of Nintendo shamelessly slapping Mario in any old random game to make a quick buck and fool clueless grandparents into buying crummy presents for their kids. Did we really need Mario Tennis, Mario Golf, or Mario Cooking, or whatever? I digress. The game itself, as a puzzle game, is actually really cool and totally spins on Tetris in a way that's familiar and yet different. Dr. Mario 64 has more of the same with unchanged gameplay mechanics, and even the music is just a remixed version of the familiar tunes from the previous entries, which is quite good. Dr. Mario 64 features several different gameplay modes, including classic as well as a career mode. There's also multiplayer battle modes where you can drop garbage pieces onto your opponents, and with the Nintendo 64's 4-player capabilities, you could technically have up to 4 players duking it out at once. Dr. Mario 64 is one of the final games to be officially released during the Nintendo 64's lifespan in April of 2001. So if you're into Dr. Mario and you want to get into the 4-player mode, this game is certainly worth a look. Batman Beyond: Return of the Joker is my favorite Batman animated film ever made. If you're not familiar with Batman Beyond, it takes place in the not too distant future with a much older and retired Bruce Wayne having passed the Batman mantle onto a younger high school student named Terry McGinnis. The series features new villains while still acknowledging the older adventures of Bruce Wayne during his days under the mask. In the film Return of the Joker, a series of crimes are taking place in Gotham City seemingly connected to the Joker. However, the Joker was thought to be long since vanquished. The film is just awesome, has lots of twists and turns, and features all the great voice acting you've come to expect from the likes of Kevin Conroy, Mark Hamill, and the many others that always made these Batman animated films so great. So I won't spoil it for you except to say, pick up Batman Beyond: Return of the Joker if you haven't seen it already. At the time, I had no idea they made a game to coincide with the film though, and maybe that's just as well. This is one of those hybrid 2D, 3D games that is side-scrolling beat 'em up while also being able to move around kinda in 3 dimensions. The 3-dimensional levels actually do look kinda neat, but this was back when everybody was made out of polygons, so the characters are all just a little yuck. And since you and the enemies can all move around in sorta 3 dimensions, it makes for a pretty awkward and frustratingly unsatisfying beat 'em up experience. I never was a fan of these hybrid 2D, 3D type games anyway, and this is a perfect example as to why. Now here's one I'd never heard of before, Star Soldier Vanishing Earth. It's the distant future and you're the last hope for Earth in this hybrid 2D top-down shooter with a hint of isometric perspective and scrolling 3-dimensional backgrounds. This was developed and released by Hudson Soft in 1998. The backgrounds remind me a lot of Blazing Star on the Neo Geo, which is another worthy shooter you should check out. In this game you take control of a fighter and have to mow through countless enemies, gaining power-ups and energy along the way. Controlling your fighter with the N64 analog stick takes a little getting used to, and I'm still not sure if I would prefer that over just using the D-pad, but after some practice I did get better. Maybe it's just because I'm pretty bad at space shooters. You fly through a variety of unique areas and the cascading backgrounds are beautiful, but somehow never seem to be too distracting from the action, unlike Asteroids Hyper 64 that we checked out earlier. There's some jaw-dropping visuals as you plow through each area, and some of the special weapons bonuses you pick up are just awesome. Blowing up enemy ships is super satisfying, and there's a fantastic soundtrack to accompany your journey. There's also some pretty epic boss battles at the end of each stage, and I'll confess, I had to use a few cheats just to get past the first boss. What can I say? I'm an old man and I'm just not as good at space shooters as I used to be. I definitely want to practice enough to play this one all the way through though, and I wish I had known about this game as a kid. It seems to go for about 20 bucks as a loose cartridge, and you could do a whole lot worse for that price on the Nintendo 64. Definitely go pick this one up if you like 2D shooters. Closing out the list today is Mischief Makers, a bizarre 1997 title developed by Treasure and released by Enix. Treasure was responsible for Gunstar Heroes and Alien Soldier on the Sega Genesis, among other things, and this was their first release on Nintendo hardware. In Mischief Makers, this old professor was just minding his own business when these creepy scream-face guys show up and kidnap him to take him to their evil emperor from planet Clancer. We don't know what's going to happen when he gets there, but we're told he's not going to have a nice time. You take control of Marina, the professor's robotic maid, and she's having none of it. In order to save the professor, you'll have to travel through 52 levels of 2.5-dimensional weirdness, where the gameplay centers mostly around grabbing and or shaking various objects or people. Hey, this guy was just minding his own business. You've also got some different jump boosts to work with. There's also nice scream face guys that try to help you on your journey, but you can just shake them too for good measure. That's what you get! The level design is not always straightforward, and it's just wacky. This game got somewhat mixed reviews during its initial release. It came out about a year or so into the Nintendo 64's lifespan. Maybe everybody was expecting more 3D games and was surprised to end up with this thing. Since then, it's amassed a bit of a cult following though, with a lot of folks clamoring for some sort of re-release or reboot. I can't say that I was as excited about this game as most folks, as I found some of the jumping boost mechanics to be unnecessarily complicated, but it's definitely different and I can't be mad at them for trying something new. This game usually goes for less than 20 bucks loose, so give it a try for yourself and see what you think. Well, that wraps it up for this episode. What are some of your favorite 2D games on the Nintendo 64? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll do my best to include them when I do a sequel to this episode. As always, thank you so much for watching. Please don't text and drive. No, seriously, I mean it. If you drive distracted, I'm gonna beat you with a sock full of nickels. See you next time on Friday Night Arcade.